to Page Stage Tips, brought to you by Pictures LLC, and it's part of the Second Z's Cube series. So this time we are going to be traveling through time with some ancient works, and also going to be exploring some different elements that are relevant to producers when thinking about should a work that is a piece of literature or another work, should it be adapted to the stage or could it be adapted to the stage? So we're going to be writing different works along those lines, and we are going to see how different works hold up. Now, this is a different framework than previously, so let's explore and we'll see how this framework reaches you. So we're going to start with the curatorial framework for stage validity. So this is our starting point, obviously, because in order to understand these works as performable systems, we have to have a baseline. So here are the standards. If in the governance of performance one seeks truth in action, not narrative indulgence, and also looks for operational clarity, you have to, first of all, look at what the work is in itself. So in this series of works, each one is not treated as literature in the customary sense or as historical residue. It's more looked at from a lens of performance architecture. So that means we're looking at not just the literary dignity or historical gravity or symbolic resonance or ritual significance, but also the capacity to generate legible action within time, space, and ensemble conditions. So the question is whether they function, not whether they are meaningful in abstraction, and also if they remain intelligible if you strip them of the interpretation by which texts are usually sustained. So the work is going to stand out if its internal order persists when reduced to stage action alone, without recourse to explanatory mediation, dramaturgical commentary, or interpretive supplement. So there is, of course, our core system, and this has 3 parts. So this inquiry is ordered according to 3 strata, that which is invariant, or the core, that which manifests itself, extension, and that which fails, edge condition. So at the foundation of every work, we have a proposition, and that is these texts are not narratives, but systems of order under constraint. So they are legible only insofar as they are expressed through movement under pressure, wherein action replaces exposition, authority as spatial or procedural force rather than psychological intent, repetition, interruption, and escalation as governing temporal logic, and clarity without explanation, where structure precedes the interpretation. So we will say that the work is valid if the internal logic remains intact when interpretation, psychology, and commentary are removed. And we have the next part, which is extension, or dramaturgical encoding. So here, if the core is constant, the expression is variable only when bounded and recognizable operators, which recur across the corpus as structural grammar rather than stylistic choice, can be found. So, for example, we have some authority systems like spatial authority, distributed authority, collapsing authority. Okay, those are 3 types of authority systems. We also have constraints: survival constraint, moral constraint, procedural constraint, for example. And we have temporal systems like interruption, cyclical return, irreversible trajectory. And we also have transmission systems like oral or sonic governance, compressed didactic form, choral or collective memory structures. Those are some of the main ones. So what differs in the periods is constant in the function. So each work will enact order through a limited set of repeatable structural operators in an ideal case. We also have edge cases, which are failure modes, and not all structures do sustain themselves under reduction. Some dissolve. And so you can classify it like this: over cyclicalization, where the structural forces are mistaken for interior motive; loss of legibility, which happens when systems cannot be apprehended in real time without explanation; closure contamination, when open systems are forced into artificial narrative resolution; aesthetic substitution, when stylistic effect replaces the structural necessity; authority collapse, when governance becomes symbolic rather than operational. So just is a symbol, it doesn't really have anything that we can grab onto. And just as a quick example, we'll look at the mini map. And we can take, for instance, Anabasis. So survival under spatial constraint gives authority. And for extension, authority merges through disciplined movement. This is by Xenophon, by the way. And cohesion is enforced by environmental pressure. Leadership is produced through necessity, not designation. And so if, for example, in the book, leadership became psychological only, it would collapse. And if the space ceased to structure action, it would also. And if survival became only a metaphor rather than condition, it would also collapse. So those are some ways that you can look at it. Now, our first work that we're going to look at, again, as I said, is Anabasis by Xenophon. And here are a few key principles. Authority is produced spatially, not declared verbally. Ensemble order functions as the primary governance structure. Survival depends on coordinated movement under sustained pressure in this work. And this is a basic structure here of the work. The expedition loses command coherence following the removal of leadership. Institutional authority no longer functions as a referencing system. The ensemble breaks into fragmented units driven by immediate survival conditions. Next, we have the reconstruction phase. Leadership emerges through necessity rather than appointment. Movement reorganizes into disciplined spatial formations. Authority becomes visible through coordinated physical structure. And then we have the continuation phase, which is where cohesion stabilizes through repeated structural movement across hostile terrains. Survival becomes procedural, and arrival resolves environmental pressure without altering underlying system logic. And here we have the dramaturgical engine. Authority is generated through enforceable spatial coordination under external pressures. So we have our adaptation routes. We could use this in ensemble physical theater based on formation discipline. We could use site-specific performances using real terrain, resistance, and spatial constraints. So a few takeaways for producers. Authority must be legible in space before speech has any validity. If spatial coordination is not immediately readable in performance conditions, the work is going to fail. This is how you can interpret works like this. Now, as far as the commissioning controls here, we have our risk, which is low to medium. The ensemble size constraint would be around 20 to 60 performers. Rehearsal failure triggers would be loss of formation integrity, inability to stabilize hierarchy under fatigue, breakdown of spatial legibility at distance. And as for touring, it could be 9 out of 10 if done well. And one should not stage it if the spatial hierarchy requires verbal explanation to remain legible, or if ensemble cohesion collapses under non-controlled terrain, or if movement systems cannot be standardized across venues. This would be eligible for repertory adaptation. So the next we have is the Mahabharata by Vyasa. And this has a few key principles. Procedural systems cannot live legitimacy. Law and mortality may diverge without structural resolutions. Escalation must remain continuously legible in action. We have the following parts. Formal stability. The court operates under intact procedural and kinship structures. Authority is institutionally recognized and publicly sustained. Beneath the surface, tensions accumulate without disruption of form. We have procedural escalation. A formal game of dice activates rule consistent escalation of stakes. Legal procedure remains intact while agency is progressively removed through lawful mechanisms. Moral contradiction emerges without interrupting continuity. And we have systemic rupture. Procedural order continues after legitimacy has collapsed, and exile and fragmentation unfold as consequences of internal contradiction. So the system persists structurally, but the moral foundation failed. So the engine here is drama is generated by the persistence of procedural systems after legitimacy has already structurally broken. Some roots of adaptation: court theater with explicit visible rule architecture. We could use this in a large-scale opera or dance system, which could show the hierarchical degradation through ensemble stratification. And as far as takeaway for producers, procedural escalation must remain visually trackable at all times. If rule logic becomes opaque, the production loses commissioning ability. This material requires governance rather than interpretive staging. It's also very high risk because you have to consider the source material, and that must be protected. And the ensemble size constraint is 20 to 120 plus performers. It's only really good for a opera house or institutional scale. The rehearsal failure triggers would be breakdown of rule legibility, confusion between legal and moral orders, unstable escalation of continuity. The touring viability is around 6 out of 10. And you need to be very careful because of the cultural content, have cultural consultants as well. And it should not be staged if rule systems can be perceived without explanation. Escalation requires narrative commentary to remain intelligible. Institutional hierarchy cannot be staged as visible structure. And moral or legal divergence collapses into psychological interpretation. And so those are the things that you should be careful to avoid. It would require a lot of supervision as well. And this would be suitable for national scale theater or opera house. The next is Ramayana by Valmiki. And here are some principles for this. Action carries moral meaning without interpretive mediation. Ethical order is embodied rather than articulated, and reduction increases structural clarity. So there are a few parts that we want to highlight. We have exile. Rama accepts exile following dynastic conflict within the court. The decision is executed without rhetorical justification or resistance. The order of the government is preserved through voluntary withdrawal rather than confusion. Continuity. Ethical discipline is maintained under conditions of deprivation and separation. Identity persists through structured action rather than institutional status. Narrative progression unfolds through parallel separation rather than causal escalation. Resolution happens here where the conflict is resolved through direct action-based confrontation. Restoration occurs through embodied return rather than negotiation or discourse. And order is established through visible consequences. Moral structure of this is fully encoded in action sequences that remain intelligible without explanatory systems. So it's a good dramaturgical engine. And this could be done in ballet, in dance or theater with reduced scenographic dependency. And you can use dance-based movement, dramaturgy, gesture-based movement, dramaturgy with also clarity of physical decision. And not just that, but also dance. Many forms could work. If meaning requires explanation, the work would fail. And action must remain sufficient to carry the full load of the narrative. So the risk band is more low because you could do it with 8 to 40 performers. The rehearsal failure would be if we have symbolic inflation, cyclicalization only of roles, or loss of action-based clarity. And so you can take this kind of piece around quite easily. Now, the things that would keep it from doing well would be if action required verbal framing to remain intelligible, or ethical logic was replaced only by psychological interpretation, like if you completely ignore the source material and don't consult cultural consultants and things, or if the reduction of staging destroys clarity of narrative consequence. Movement cannot independently carry moral structure. Fully commissionable under a repertory condition, it could be very easy to tour and stable cross-venue transfer will be possible. It's also for institutional and movement-based opera adaptation or other types of performing arts. The next one is the Book of Job by Unknown. Here are some principles that we can learn from here. Catastrophe is staged without causal mediation. Silence operates as structural temporal pressure. Explanation is delayed without resolution. So here are a few parts. We have the catastrophe, which is where Job experiences successive losses that are staged as immediate visible events. No causal framework is introduced or implied. Suffering is presented as a mediated structure of facts. Silence is there. An extended period of silence falls between Job and his companions. Presence is sustained without interpretive speech or explanatory intervention. And time is the pressure. And there's also failed explanation. So competing discourses are there, but they don't converge. So there's no interpretive system kind of stabilizing it until the end. Although it's never quite fully explained either why this happened. So silence, we can learn, is a controlled suspension of causality under conditions of visible suffering. This would be more restricted, so you could use it in tableau theater or choral systems with delayed and structurally regulated speech entry, or it could be in the form of music or dance. Silence is valid after full stage catastrophe, and if introduced prematurely, it becomes useless. So it's not like an atmospheric thing. The risk is quite high, actually, and the ensemble restraint would be 5 to 25 performers, because this is kind of hard to stage, and it's easy to lose the pressure. But if you did it successfully, you could tour it quite easily because it's a small cast kind of thing. So that would be an 8. So again, it's important not to over-explain it. It's important for performers to understand silence and that kind of thing. And it's kind of hard to stage, but if done well, it could really make an impact on the audience. The next one is 1001 Nights, also by Anonymous. So some principles we can learn here are that retention is produced through interruption, closure is structurally prohibited rather than deferred, continuity depends on enforced incompletion. Narrative king begins under coercive storytelling constraint and immediately establishes attention. Each part introduces a self-contained attention structure. Engagement is secured through initiation. And then we have the interruption part, which is each narrative unit is systematically interrupted before resolution. So it's really left incomplete. And continuation becomes important for the survival of Scheherazade in the system. And it makes a kind of a series. So these interruptions, of course, stabilize into repeating principles, and closure is consistently withheld across the unit. So the system achieves continuity there. And the audience retention is generated through a structured absence of closure at the level of each unit, and the stories are very impactful and engaging as well. So you could use dramaturgy here, you could use dance, you could use music, and this could be a multi-evening repertory system if you wanted to experiment with that. And retention depends really on refusal of closure and how it's done. So every ending needs to be a cliffhanger, essentially. This risk is a medium risk with ensemble size constraint 6 to 40 performance. There could be some rehearsal failures like breakdown of discipline or loss of continuity. But you could definitely tour this. So this would be a 9 out of 10. And again, those are the disadvantages if you can't ensure that the audience is really engaged, that the cliffhanger, I should say, is not very engaging, then that can cause some definite problems for our viewers. This could be a serial system, it could be a festival-based kind of structure, but it requires very strong timing of episodes. We also next have the Epic of Gilgamesh, also by an unknown author. And there are some principles that we can see here, such as identities formed through relational opposition, mortality is the governing structure constraint, and loss produces irreversible transformation of trajectory. So here are some parts to know about the story. Gilgamesh exercises unchecked authority within Uruk. Structural imbalance is challenged through the emergence of Enkidu. I can never say his name right. Enkidu. As an equalizing counterforce. Identity becomes relational rather than absolute. Stabilized confrontation happens in the next section where conflict resolves into functional companionship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Joint action establishes temporary equilibrium. Mortality enters as a structural limit through confrontation with the divine and natural order. Enkidu's death produces a non-reversible rupture in relational structure. Gilgamesh's trajectory shifts from heroic action to confrontation with morality and mortality. And there's no restoration of original equilibrium. So the engine here is transformation is generated through relational formation and loss. So you could use two protagonist structure, theater with mirror kind of embodiment. You could use ritualized performance system. You could use dance here as well. And the relational structure needs to be physically visible at all times. Loss must be staged as irreversible structure rupture, not emotional expression. So mortality is a constant condition for the work as well. And the risk will be a medium, of course. You have to really consider the cultures where we are presenting here. And so the ensemble size constraint here would be about 8 to 30 performers. And if there was too much symbolism, or if it was really watered down too much, it could really fail as a piece. Or if it loses the clarity of the relationship there. But it's a very interesting epic story, which could have success touring if the story is well done. So in terms of how it's adapted, we would give that an 8. And this is suitable for musical theater, ritual staging, opera, dance, and also requires strict control of how you structure these different scenes and episodes of the work, because it's very epic in size, and there's lots of different little things happening all the time. Now, the next one that we want to look at is the Bible. And we have multiple authors. And here, the authority is distributed across competing narrative systems, covenant structures, continuity, cross rupture, and meaning is produced through cyclical return. So we have the first section, which is formation, and that's the creation narrative, which makes a world ordered through spoken authority and covenant binding. The early social order is structured through law, ritual, and relational obligations. Authority is dispersed across divine human contracts. Fragmentation is where prophetic interruption destabilizes institutional continuity. Kingship, law, and covenant are contested through rupture and warning structures. And order is here through reinterpretation and ritual adjustment. Now we also have the last phase, which is reconstitution. So the continuity is maintained through repetition of the covenantal and liturgical cycles. Resolution is not final closure, but restored alignment. And so the system persists as well through this continual cyclical approach. Now, we could use this for ritual theater, of course, with liturgical repetition systems. We could use this in choral, dramaturgy, music, multi-episode, institutional performance cycles, dance. It really adapts to quite a few, just like Gilgamesh. And the material cannot be adapted as linear narrative without repetition. So that's one constraint. It's very sensitive as well, so it is a high risk kind of thing to put on, and you can have between 10 or over 100 performers if you want. And there's so much content here that it's very hard to adapt unless you pick specific stories. So for touring, you could say it's a 7, but we cannot reduce things into motif or simply a linear kind of structure because there's a lot of episodes. I mean, you could tell, for example, the story of a certain character, but if you're trying to tell the whole history, there's no time to really do that. And it requires more discretion if you want to put it on because it is controversial. The next work here is Beowulf, and also by Anonymous. And some principles here, we have heroic identity is defined through repeated confrontation. Monstrosity functions as structural opposition. And death completes narrative form. So, Beowulf goes into the crisis system of the Danish court. Grendel appears as non-social structural disruption. And heroic identity is activated through external confrontation. So then there's containment, where there are successive confrontations, Grendel's mother, and there's kind of temporary order. Then heroic legitimacy is reinforced through escalating physical trials. Stability remains conditional. And then finally, we have the completion, which is the final confrontation, which results in victory at mortal cost. Beowulf's death completes the structural arc. So social order persists, but the heroic identity terminates in sacrifice. So one of the engines here is heroic structure is generated through escalating confrontation, culminating in tragedy or irreversible death, if you want to call it that way. And you could use this for physical combat theater, choral epic reconstruction, ritual historic or heroic staging, and maybe even for dance. It would be kind of hard for that, maybe. Maybe could work for opera, though it's not quite as grandiose as some of them. And the confrontation is the primary language of structure. So death must function as a formal thing, but you also have to show the escalation here. So it has to really build on itself so that it's not like too predictable or boring to the audience. The risk size here is medium because it's a combat theater. We have size constraint, maybe 10 to 40 performers. The thing needs to really be epic in terms of visually to make it work, and really needs to take care in terms of the props and also how they tell the story in a way that keeps the people really engaged. So we would say that would be viable as a touring fixture, around 8, but it would be most suitable, I think, for stage physical theater, though it could go into other forms of art as well, performing arts. The next one is the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. And power here is a system. And so speech also has to function as a strategic action within the government structure and leadership structures there. And collapse was the outcome of structural pressure. So those are the principles that we want to introduce. Now, there's lots of principles for each of these kinds of works. These are just scratching the surface. There's a lot of things that you can explore in these works. They're so interesting, actually. So we have the tension between Athens and Sparta, which is intensifying consistently through imperial logics. And the alliances shift as the pressures increase, war emerges. And then we have pressure. So political and military decisions expose limits of expansion and control. Rational calculations produce unstable outcomes. And speech becomes this very important and powerful driver to the narrative. And then we have collapse. So the Athenian overreach results in breakdown, and their defeat emerges through cumulative imbalance, and order reconfigures through redistribution of power. So political truth or government truth emerges here through visible system level conflicts. And we could see this working in civic theater or chorus-driven dramaturgy, or you could use possibly dance as well, similar to what you can do with Spartacus. And power must be staged as a system of force here, rather than individual psychology. Although you should focus on certain characters, of course, to make it work, and their psychology there. And the collapse has to be more of a system collapse, but this is kind of hard to perform as well. So we're going to give this a medium-high risk. The ensemble constraint size would be 12 to 60. And give it a 7 out of 10 for touring by ability. It's useful in terms of the festival circuit if done well. And you could even do it outdoors. It would definitely require a lot of discipline ensemble as well to represent the power structures. So you'd have to get permission to do this because there's a lot of stage combat and such, just like any of these works. It's a matter of permission by the people who are stakeholders, and you have to consider the fact that for some of these, they're more dangerous, such as this one. Then we have the Nibelungenlied by Anonymous. And this is where we can see a few other principles, such as honor systems generate structural consequence beyond intention. Revenge in this case is a mechanism, and the escalation is inevitable once the breach occurs. So here are some parts that we want to highlight. The Burgundian court maintains equilibrium through codified honor relations and their ceremonial hierarchies. Social order appears stable because symbolic codes are intact, but relational fault lines are accumulating. Then we have activation. A breach of honor, of course, triggers the irreversible revenge logic of the piece, and we have diplomatic and court structures attempting containment, but they're not efficient or sufficient. So escalation comes quickly through role-consistent retaliation. Then you reach the point of collapse, where revenge reaches the saturation of the system and destroys the governing structure. So violence expands beyond individual control into the dissolution of the institution. So social order, in this case, collapses under its own honor logic. So that's very interesting. This is, of course, a ritual court tragedy with honor grammar in movement and speech. And this kind of operatic escalation is there with ensemble-based retaliatory cycles. You could use it so in opera very well, actually, and we could also use it in mass theater, which would be very interesting. Or you could use it in dance, like a ballet or modern dance adaptations, but ballet probably would be very nice, or hybrid forms. And it's important that the honor is staged as a system as well, and the escalation needs to remain unavoidable. Revenge does not need to be just psychologically motivated. It has to also focus on how the system is collapsing. So our risk band here would be medium, and the constraint would be 12 to 60 players. We have also our touring viability could be 8 if the budget's there. And this could be done, like I said, for opera, ritual theater, or movement systems of dance. And that's all I want to say about that one. The next one is Panchatantra by Vishnu Sharma. And this one is interesting because it has animal characters. So we have this political and governing intelligence is transmitted through narrative compression, and moral cognition is learned through consequence-structured analogies. And human behavior is staged via the animal proxies that are there. So here are some parts that we want to highlight. A pedagogical crisis establishes the need for governance education. The instructor sets a system in which political survival depends on narrative stimulation. Learning is defined as structured exposure to consequence. Sequential animal narratives show power negotiation, betrayal, alliance, and strategic deception. And each story is a self-contained scenario. Meaning is derived from repetition and repeated exposure to consequence under variation. So the fables resolve into applied behavioral intelligence for governance, and lessons consolidate into actionable prudence. And then the narrative becomes knowledge that's actually useful. So this cognitive competence is formed through repeated exposure to structurally contained consequences. So it's like there's this constant reminder happening of different things, and it teaches through repetition. So this could be done in children's theater, could be done in episodic fable theater, educational theater, music, definitely dance, especially ballet, and other styles too work well. And also you could use the traditional Indian dance styles as well. And the meaning is here produced through repetition of consequence under variation. So if the audience can't extract practical logic from each unit, it's not going to work. This is very low risk, and you could definitely tour this very easily. This needs only about 6 to 30 people, and it can be clearly done through the animal systems. So it is great for festivals, training theaters, institutional theaters, all kinds of different contexts. I think this is a very, very interesting and adaptable work. The next one is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And here are a few principles that we want to highlight. Interior discipline is the primary site of governance. Action is evaluated through rational restraint under pressure, and meaning is produced through alignment between perception and duty. So here are a few parts that I want to highlight for you. The ruler establishes continual correction of perception under conditions of different pressures. External events are treated as neutral material. So discipline here is a control of attention rather than action. And then the second part, we have ethical pressure under various constraints. So daily experiences of power, fatigue, and uncertainty are met through self-regulation, Emotional reaction is subordinated to rational evaluation of duty. Conflict is relocated from external events to internal judgment. And then we have stabilization. So consistent alignment between intention and action produces stable behavior under instability. External disorder persists, but internal governance remains, and virtue is enacted as continuous discipline. So we have here governance happening through sustained regulation of perception, judgment, and response under pressure. Now, monologue theater is also structured as internal reasoning. Choral reflection is also something that you could do, or minimalist actor-based performance. I don't think this would work in a lot of other contexts. Discipline must be staged as continuous cognitive action under pressure, and if interior conflict becomes only a psychological drama without structure, it's not as impactful. So we could say this is lower risk. It needs 1 to 12 performers, and it can also have a choir. So if things were too emotional or unclear or really kind of disorganized in terms of, oversimplifying or overdoing it in terms of the lessons, making it too obvious, I think it would be a loss here. But it's definitely tolerable because you don't really need too many people to make this work. This is great for chamber theater, festivals, solo or choral hybrid forms, and minimalist staging. And our last work, which is the bonus work, is the Quran. This is traditionally attributed to divine revelation received by the Prophet Muhammad. And here are a few different principles that we can see from here, which would be revelation is fundamentally sonic and performative. And meaning is carried through recitation, cadence, and communal audition. Authority is produced through disciplined vocal transmission. So the first thing we notice is that revelation, in this case, the spoken word enters history as discontinuity within ordinary time. So recitation is not commentary. And authority is established through auditory encounters rather than narrative explanation. Then we have codification through recitation. Revelation stabilizes into structured recitational forms governed by precise vocal discipline. So meaning is preserved through controlled repetition and memorization. Community coherence is formed through shared practice. And then we have liturgical continuity here, which is where recitation becomes continuous communal infrastructure. And of course, the text also has authority maintained through the oral tradition and also written tradition of the work. Now, this has originally been transmitted by the oral tradition in addition to written later when everything was written down. And so something that's interesting is that you could do this. This should be more spoken or sung. So, of course, it needs minimal staging as well. Now, of course, again, as in some of the previous works, is a very high risk, of course, because you need to make sure that you treat this work with respect, and the material cannot be staged without really having good disciplined vocal performance. This is more of a performance piece, like you could use it for music or some other ways, but it has to be done very carefully. The ensemble constraint could use 1 to 50 people, and it's not theater. It's more reflective or moral, I'd say, than a spectacle. So it could be done and toured, but you have to be very careful to consult with the relevant people. And this is highly valuable in terms of music, as I said. And that leads us to the end of our little journey. But I do have some reflection questions, such as, where in your current body of work does structure remain legible without interpretation? And where does interpretation become necessary? Which works in your repertoire depend on psychological explanation when their underlying logic could be expressed more as spatial, procedural, or temporal system? And where do you currently mistake character agency for what may actually be systemic pressure? And if all the explanatory language was removed, which works would still be readable? Those are some questions you could ask yourself. But our main thing that we want to end with here is that we really just broke this down as far as, okay, if we just take the things into bones, structure of skin and bones, so to speak, what can we do with it? And we're not really suggesting you where to go with it, but more just looking at what could be done with it. And lots of things have been done with these works. So we recommend you to check out what's already been done in your context, if you're interested. And I think the main takeaway here is that it's less important to focus on spectacles or grandeur or, oh wow, kind of thing. And more important to look at things as far as how can they be done in a small way, and then could they scale, if they can scale, and how memorable is the story, or how memorable is the work? Does it really make an impact on your audience mind, and does it transform them in some way? I think those are some things to consider. And this concludes our small take. Again, there's many things we could have said or gone into a lot of details. We just kind of skimmed through. But I think it just helps us to think about different works in a new way compared to how we've been sharing with you here earlier. So we hope you were able to think and maybe open up your mind to discover literature in a different way. And if not, that's fine too. We'll be back when we have more time.